Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Sean Ulmer. I'm Executive Director here at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, and I want to thank you all for joining us today for the third in a six-part lecture series on the life and work of Grant Wood. This lecture series was developed to accompany three temporary exhibitions that we've installed on Grant Wood. Americans in Paris, Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn's 1920 trip to Paris, Grant Wood Revealed, Rarely Seen Works by an American Master, and Seriously Funny, American Gothic Parodies. These exhibitions and this accompanying educational programming was designed to celebrate the 125th anniversary of the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art in 2020, as well as kick off the 175th anniversary of Iowa's statehood in 2021. We could think of no better way to celebrate both our own anniversary and Iowa's anniversary than taking a deep dive look at the work of Grant Wood. Now, both these exhibitions and the educational programming would not have been possible without the generous support of numerous individuals, corporations, and foundations, and I want to take a moment to recognize their support before turning things over to today's speaker. First and foremost, I want to thank the Henry Luce Foundation, a New York-based foundation who came on board to support Americans in Paris, Grant Wood Revealed, and our previous 125 masterworks from the collection. The Luce Foundation supports many wonderful and worthwhile scholarly projects, and one of those is American art. And so knowing that we are a particularly strong museum in American art, they were thrilled to be able to support us during our anniversary year. They were joined by the McIntyre Foundation, a locally based foundation that supports many wonderful nonprofits in the community and has been a friend of the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art for many years. Also want to thank the Robert and Esther Armstrong Charitable Trust. The Armstrongs knew Grant Wood. Grant Wood actually worked in the Armstrong home, and the Armstrong Trust has supported numerous Grant Wood projects here at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. They were joined by a number of corporate partners, Collins Aerospace, CRST International, and Great America Financial Services. All three of those organizations, major employers in this community, came on board to help support the Grant Wood trio of exhibitions and the educational programming such as this lecture series. In addition, annual support is received by the museum from the Iowa Arts Council, which is a division of the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs and the National Endowment for the Arts. We also received annual support from the Greater Cedar Rapids Community Foundation in the form of their Funds for the Community 2020 grant. And we receive individual support from those of you here on this program, as well as many others, through your purchase of memberships and your contributions to the annual fund. My thanks to you for helping make that possible. And I want to call out also that we receive annual educational support from Transamerica, which helps us with our educational programming throughout the year. My thanks to all of our funders, which, as I said, make these exhibitions and these educational programming, possible. And now I want to introduce today's speaker. Paul Juhl is a historian and an author. He's a graduate of the University of Iowa in Iowa City with majors in history and education. He is a retired educator, serving as a teacher, counselor, and administrator in both public and private schools, both here in Iowa and in Switzerland. He received his master's degree in college student personnel work from the University of Northern Iowa in Cedar Falls and completed additional graduate work at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley. He is a collector of photographic images from the later decades of the 19th century, and that resulted in a large collection of stereographs, carte de visite, and cabinet cards that are now housed at the State Historical Society of Iowa in Iowa City. He is the author of numerous spiral-bound books dealing with Iowa history, including topics concerning the grandchildren of Abraham Lincoln, author McKinley Cantor, actress Sarah Bernhardt, and architect Frank Lloyd Wright. He has done extensive research on Grant Wood with spiral-bound book titles Grant Wood's Clear Lake Summer, Grant Wood Abandoned Plans, and Grant Wood and the Iowa State Fair. Paul, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Sean. And we'll go to share screen here. And I will begin. Well, our Iowa painter, Grant Wood, created numerous works of art, certainly during his lifetime, and reached perhaps the pinnacle of success with his masterpiece, American Gothic, in 1930. According to some polls, this painting of a man and his daughter has become the most recognizable depiction in America, and arguably joins Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa and Edvard Munch's The Scream as possibly the most recognizable pieces of art in the entire world. Now, there was never any doubt that those close to Grant Wood felt he had numerous projects ahead of him, and he may have even been approaching the height of his career just before his illness. But Grant's death in February of 1942, just short of his probable 51st birthday. I say that because I recently saw the death certificate that was signed at university hospitals, and it said that he was only approaching his 50th birthday. So one is a little unclear on that, but this death took away all of his plans and, of course, all of his promise. Now, University of Iowa president at that time, Virgil Hancher, went to a memorial for Grant Wood, and he said the following. He said, "He was still a young man at the height of his powers, and there was reason to believe that he was on the threshold of a great creativeness. It is difficult, therefore," said President Hancher, "to measure the loss which his early death has caused." Well, with the death of any person, famous or not so famous, dreams, plans, and ideas quickly come to an end. With an artist, the admirers are left to wonder just what could have been created for the generations who follow to enjoy and treasure. Now, we will never completely know what Grant Wood wanted to accomplish, but today I'm going to show you a few of his ideas that remained just that, abandoned plans. And I'll take these in segments. During the fall of 1938, Sarah Maxon Wood, the woman that Grant Wood had married, she and Grant separated, and Sarah eventually moved to the west coast of America. So consequently, there was a need for a live-in housekeeper. And a young Mennonite woman living in Henry County, south of Iowa City, applied for the job. Mindell Wagler, who was 20 years old at this time and a recent high school graduate, was looking for a housekeeping position. Now, Mindell had heard that housekeepers in Iowa City, they were paid more money than those in her small hometown, and she was really eager to secure a position. She interviewed for the job and quickly accepted it. And she was to stay in Grant's employ for about 3 years. Now, Mindell remembered many of the things from that time period, 1938 to 1941. Grant was doing much of his painting in his home during those years. Mindell especially remembered, and she told me that she watched him paint the cherry tree in one of the paintings, Parson Weems' Fable. And she was also there, she said, when he created the colored lithographs, all 4 of them in his collection. Well, Grant was known to have, and in this photo that you're seeing there, that is Mindell, probably about 8 years ago when I was in her home, and she's showing a picture of her taken at the time of her employ by Grant Wood. Well, Grant was known to have used friends as models for some of his paintings, so it really wasn't surprising to any of us, I guess, that Grant asked Mindell to pose for one of his drawings. He told her that the piece would be called "The Family Saying Grace," and that no one would ever recognize her. He completed a preliminary sketch on brown wrapping paper and included 4 other characters. The drawing featured 3 generations of a family, and Merbel would be at the center of the drawing, portraying the wife and the mother figure. She told me that Grant had her sit in a window in his studio and pose, wearing a family brooch and also an apron. A young boy and his sister were also part of the drawing, and for this, Grant used 2 of the children of a family friend and neighbor, Dr. George Stoddard, who at that time was dean of the graduate school at the University of Iowa. Art Stoddard was about 8 at this time, and his younger sister Ellie was about 6. Now, it's unknown who Grant used as the 2 characters of the father and the grandfather. Well, the finished work would be made into a lithograph, Grant said, and he thought the market for this one would really be limitless in many American dining rooms at the end of the 1930s. He thought it would be prominently displayed. But then Grant seemed to put the lithograph on hold, and Merbel watched as he sketched more paintings, and often working on several of them at the same time. So consequently, A Family Saying Grace was never finished. But after Grant's death, a portion of the drawing was published in the November 1942 issue of Ladies' Home Journal, but it showed only Merbel and Art Stoddard. Well, a neighbor in Merbel's small town brought it to Merbel's attention and said that she recognized Merbel right away. A poem titled Grace accompanied the colored drawing. Now, no one is really sure how the magazine got the image, but my guess would be that it was probably lent by Nan Wood Graham, Grant's sister. The Family Saying Grace on that brown paper is now in the hands of the Figge Art Museum in Davenport. They purchased it from Nan Wood Graham in 1965. Well, let me tell you about Merbel, because she remains a close friend of mine. She's now 102 years old, and she still lives in her own home and proudly tells me she does her own wash. She's a widow who has raised 5 children. Merbel had often spoken with her family about her experiences with Grant Wood, but when I was going through Nan Wood's scrapbooks at the Figge in Davenport, I came across a photo I'm going to show you. And when I showed Merbel this photo, she was just thrilled, because now she had photographic evidence of one of her days in Iowa City. Well, here you see Merbel coming from the kitchen area. You see Grant tossing a salad. You see his sister, Nan Wood Graham, seated. And the other character in this photograph is Park Reinert, Grant's close friend and secretary. Now Merbel had something to show the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren, and she was very proud. She told me too that her association with Grant was a beautiful experience in her life and one she would never forget. Now the next segment, and we're going to jump around time-wise here, but the next segment, by the way, this is 1142 East Court Street, I think, in Iowa City, and that was a place of employment for Merbel during her time with Grant Wood. The next segment is called The Wolf and the Lamb. Well, this grouping of pencil and ink on paper drawings that's entitled The Wolf and the Lamb, it's also at the Figge Art Museum in Davenport. And there's really some mystery surrounding these Grant Wood pieces that were probably completed in the late 1930s or early 1940s. And the speculation surrounds a patriotism that many Americans began to feel as the United States inched towards World War II. Now, Grant didn't record what the drawings were to represent, but he did provide a few clues. And it's important to step back into the time period to try to determine just what he might have been thinking. As a background, Grant really had some history with patriotism. As many of you know, he served in World War I, later did a mural for Harrison School called democracy leading the world on to victory. And we all know of the magnificent memorial window for the Veterans Memorial Building in Cedar Rapids. So Grant, therefore, may have had some strong feelings when in 1938, the British Prime Minister Chamberlain signed the Munich Agreement, conceding the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia to Nazi Germany. The war was certainly on the minds of many Americans throughout 1939 and the early months of 1940, when Grant probably created this series of drawings. On the drawing pad, he sketched one bushy eyebrowed face and titled it Chamberlain. Another sketch shows a snarling wolf and a weak-kneed lamb. One could speculate that the wolf may have represented either the Nazis or Adolf Hitler, and Chamberlain, of course, the lamb, but this particular one was not identified as such. And another partial sketch shows a lion and a fox. But under one of the drawings, Grant had handwritten one of Aesop's fables concerning these two animals. Well, these ancient fables date way back to the 6th century BC, and each was intended to teach a lesson to the young children. Well, under the sketch, Grant tells the tale of the wolf and the lamb. Here it is. Once upon a time, a wolf was lapping at a spring when, looking up, he saw a lamb just beginning to drink. There is my supper, thought the wolf, if I can only find some excuse to seize it. Then he called out to the lamb, "How dare you muddle the water from which I am drinking?" "Nay, master, nay," said the lamb. "If the water be muddy up there, I cannot be the cause of it, for the spring runs down from you to me." "Well then," said the wolf, "why did you call me bad names this time last year?" "That cannot be," said the lamb. "I am only 6 months old." "I don't care," snarled the wolf. "If it was not you, it was your father," and such that he rushed upon the poor lamb and ate him up. But before the lamb died, he gasped, "Any excuse will serve a tyrant." Well, based on some of the things that Grant said in a 1941 interview, he seemed strong in his belief that artists needed to find their place in this awakening of America. As the entire nation looked on with much apprehension at what was taking place in Europe and the Far East in those days, months, and years, Grant did speak out his concerns. But his only major contribution was this poster that he completed for a group called Bundles for Britain Incorporated, whose purpose was to send American clothing and medical supplies to England. The image shows a mother shielding her child from Nazi bomber planes. Grant's approval to do this poster certainly indicated his international concerns at this time. The next segment involves a rural church in Johnson County. Grant had long enjoyed traveling around the eastern Iowa countryside and observing the works of both man and nature. After marrying Sarah Maxon and moving to Iowa City in 1935, pleasant Sunday drives were common for Grant and his wife. The couple would load up his old Ford car with his sketch pad and camera and set out to explore the highways and the byways. On one such trip, after a conversation with a colleague, Grant made it a point to seek out a deserted church building that had been described to him. Well, as expected, the brick church located just north of the small town of Morris in Graham Township in Johnson County. This would be about 8 miles northeast of Iowa City. This church had immediate appeal for Grant. Although it had been deserted for many years, Grant's eyes seemed to understand its significance, and he thought it to be an architectural gem. It had been built by pioneer Methodists in 1874, and he later discovered that the formal name of the church was St. John's Methodist Episcopal Church, but all the local people called it the Old Zimmerland Church. Now, Grant was aware that around the campus, there was talk of a need for a chapel at the University of Iowa. And perhaps it was in connection with the recently completed Iowa Memorial Union. So Grant then brought this deserted church to the attention of the university's architect, George Horner. Now, initially, Grant thought that perhaps they could, the old Zimmerlin Church could be moved to Iowa City, but after inspecting the structural stability and strength of the bygone building, it was decided that that option would be impossible. So the idea was then presented that perhaps an exact replica could be made. Well, Grant liked this idea and continued with his personal interest in the project. He also had a place in mind somewhere just west of the new Fine Arts campus on the west side of the river. This was a place of natural beauty, he thought, to complement the history of the structure. Now, I'm thinking that that could have been where now we have the West Art Building, because that's right along the quarry that it has filled with water, and it is a place of great scenic beauty. It would be on the west side of the river. Now, that's just my assumption. Well, Grant made sketches and took measurements of the roof line, windows, and the steeple of the old Zimmerlin Church. And in early 1938, Grant went to speak with officials at the university about constructing this chapel on university property. He also shared his dream of providing and painting 40 murals on the walls of the chapel. The art would, according to Grant, depict the history of religions in Iowa. Two students built a model, and various financial considerations were made to move the project forward. But by 1939, the project had stalled. Grant felt that the building itself needed to be erected first in order for him to be able to visualize the walls necessary for the possible murals. He hoped the structure would be completed in time for the centennial of the University of Iowa in 1947. University administrators, however, felt the murals should be finished first and didn't believe there would be any help coming from the state legislature in terms of funding. Grant again stated that he expected to make this the outstanding mural contribution of his life, and he told them that it would take at least 10 years for him to complete the 40 murals. He said he felt the little brick chapel would capture the very uniqueness that was religion in Iowa. And at the end of the university's fiscal year in 1939, the whole idea was placed on hold and permanently postponed for 5 years. Well, this coincided with a rather rough time for Grant. He had some problems in the fine arts department that many of you know of. He also had finalized his divorce from Sarah. And of course, no one knew at that time that Grant didn't have 5 years left. He would not see that 5-year time period. Well, the old Zimmerlin Church was torn down in 1941, just months before Grant died. And this piece of fertile Iowa soil on which it had stood for decades was turned back into cropland. But the university didn't give up on the idea of a chapel, and they received some funds in the early 1950s from the Danforth Foundation in St. Louis. The chapel would be based on the model from Grant and the same dimensions as the original church structure, but now it would be located on the east side of the river in an open green space just south of the Memorial Union building, that area that we now call Hubbard Field. It was dedicated in January of 1953, with the total cost being $30,000 and a building that could seat 75 people. Well, it's been used over the years for many weddings and is really beloved by students and faculty. But one can only imagine what the chapel might have meant to not only Iowans, but all Americans with the addition of Grant's 40 proposed murals. But that was not to be. The murals he had envisioned would never be seen. And there's a completed, and you can see the resemblance, can't you, to the old Zimmerlin Church. My next segment is going to talk about Francis Merbel Wood. And here is a photo of Grant's father. He married Grant's mother in 1886, and that union produced 4 children, Grant being the second born. Grant was just 10 when his father suddenly died in March of 1901, and his memories of him were limited to that of a boy his age. Well, Grant entered University of Iowa hospitals on November 24th, 1941, and would remain a patient there for the rest of his life. An operation was done on December 19th, and Grant was told that he had advanced cancer and that his life would be measured in months now instead of years. But the doctors were not totally sure just how long Grant would live. Grant seemed to find some strength in the knowledge that he might be able to do some painting. He told a visitor, "I want to go back to my studio. I've got lots of pictures I want to paint." Well, the hope of leaving the hospital didn't last very long. After some really anxious times in the early mornings, Grant realized that he needed to remain in the hospital. He did try to maintain a degree of normalcy in his life and thought that he might be able to do some painting even in the hospital. He was said to have told his longtime friend Marvin Cohn that he planned to paint right here in the hospital. And one of the things he had said to Marvin was that during the first weeks in the hospital, the idea had come to him that he might paint a picture of his father, Merbel Wood. He felt that although only 10 years old when his father died, he could remember him very well. He also had an old daguerreotype or tintype of his father that he could use. He planned this to be a companion piece to the painting he had done of his mother called Woman with Plants. Some speculated that Grant may have felt this could be sold by his sister Nan for some extra income after his death. But Grant continued to fail, and it became apparent that he would no longer be able to paint. Now, just recently, a lot of the people that visited Grant at the hospital felt he never could have done any painting because his illness was so severe. But then I ran across, in doing some research, I ran across one of the doctors at the hospital, whose name was Hans Ehrenhaft, said he kept drawing and painting and doing things of that sort and was very accepting of his fate. So one's not sure exactly. I do know that he gave some copies of his lithographic prints to some of the nurses and doctors who had taken care of him. Well, Grant never mentioned to anyone what he wanted to represent in the painting of his father. If he did have something in mind, he was evidently too ill to share it. The next segment I'm calling The Bath, 1880. Well, Grant thought he had come up with a great idea in the latter weeks of December 1934. He even had a name for the new proposed painting. He was going to call it The Bath 1880. And in the Daily Iowan of December 15th, 1934, Grant wrote, "I have in mind a picture that I'm going to do. I'm going to do it in a very serious vein, regardless of how people take it. The picture," he went on to explain, "must be quite authentic. The main part of the painting would be an old gentleman wearing only red flannel underwear who would be standing next to a round wooden tub. In the background would hang blue checked aprons. The man would be pouring steaming water into the tub from a kettle. It would be his Saturday night bath, and the man would be looking rather grim. You know, at that time in the 1880s, people only took baths about once a week. And in the winter, there was always a chance of catching cold, developing pneumonia, and even of dying. Well, Grant was really looking forward for a chance to use the color red for the underwear. He said, "Oh, for years I've envied the old Flemish painters because they were able to use such brilliant, lovely red in their paintings of men. Modern costume does not permit that, and the artist is limited in his color range by the somber dress of his model." But Grant had trouble finding a suit of underwear that he liked to use for the Cedar Rapids man he had chosen to use as his model. Well, Grant was always extremely interested in details, and he had a huge problem with this underwear. You see, the question arose on whether the red flannels of that period had knitted wrists or pull-up strings, and there was no way to settle it except to get a suit. He wanted some that were well worn and maybe a little baggy in the back. Well, his first search in Cedar Rapids turned up nothing. No one seemed to want to admit, at least, that they even never once used such a clothing item. Grant asked at various stores in town and even contacted a costume customer company in Chicago that he had previously worked with. During the latter months of 1934, he even advertised through the classifieds in newspapers in Minnesota, Illinois, and Iowa for an authentic suit. Well, finally, some underwear was found in Minneapolis, of all places, and there was a report that a sketch had been made and it would be finished by the end of 1935 that Grant had done. But the bath 1880 was never painted. Critics of Grant, some probably jealous of his success, began to say that the advertisements he had placed were too much like publicity seeking, and that they felt was unseemly for an artist. Now, Nan, in her book, My Brother Grant Wood, said, that made Grant so mad that he refused to do the painting. And ever after that, whenever red flannel underwear was mentioned, his face would become flushed. He became so angry. It would have been his most famous painting, perhaps, because of the publicity given by the newspapers, but he would not speak about the painting again, Nan said. That was the one time, she said, that she actually saw Grant downright angry. In fact, the most unusual thing about him, to me, she said, was his continual good humor. He rarely showed anger, and it took quite a bit to get him stirred up. Well, just 2 months after all of this controversy, there was a news item of the marriage of Grant and Sarah. 2 months later, there they appear, announcing their marriage, and the title identifies them not as a painter of American Gothic, Young Corn, or Stone City, but the red flannel underwear painter. Red flannel artist is wed. Throughout Iowa, the rest of the nation, the controversy over this never completed painting was still on people's minds. But perhaps Grant did use that underwear he was seeking, because he did a lithograph in 1939. And as art historian Jane Malash wrote in her work titled Grant Wood Studio, the long underwear ended up in a lithograph, Midnight Alarm, depicting a man holding a kerosene lamp to light his way down a staircase. The next segment is titled Self-Portrait of Grant. When Grant died, he left an unfinished oil, a self-portrait taken from a sketch made a decade earlier, and this is that sketch that was made earlier. In early 1932, the Iowa Federation of Women's Clubs asked a group of Iowa artists to submit self-portraits in a statewide competition. The sketch Grant submitted showed him wearing overalls and a light-colored shirt, his typical work outfit. He also included a windmill and some rolling Iowa countryside as a background. Wood was pleased when this self-portrait was voted the most popular in the competition. And this is now owned by the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. But during the next years, Grant took his sketch and created a nearly identical painting in oil. He altered a part of the painting that showed his outfit, deciding that the overall straps detracted from the portrait. He added an open collared shirt and other elements in the background. This partially completed painting was to stay in Grant's studio for the next 10 years, until the end of his life. Now, how often he worked on it and why he never completely finished it is unknown, but he was evidently never quite satisfied with the outcome. He did keep the windmill in the background, as you can see, and he once said, "The old masters all had their trademarks, and mine will be the windmill. Whenever it is feasible to use it, I will." After Grant's death, however, his sister Nan asked Marvin Cohn about the unfinished self-portrait and quizzed him concerning what he thought Grant might have wanted to do to complete the project. Well, Cohn wasn't sure, Marvin wasn't sure, but did take on the project and did some work on it. Cohn, in a November 21st, 1950 letter written to Nan after completion of his work, said, "I have repainted only the little somewhat triangular shapes on either side of the neck, following very carefully the lines originally used by Grant, also the colors. These could be seen despite his scratching out of the area. The little haystacks on the left I introduced because in the first painting or underpainting, of which David Turner has a photograph, they appear. I am pleased with the result and hope it meets your approval. I am always glad to help you in whatever way I can, and perhaps I'm helping out Grant too. Cordially, signed Marvin Cohn." This segment I'll title Nebraska. There were two important projects in the state of Nebraska that Grant showed interest in pursuing. The first was a possible mural for the Nebraska State Capitol building in Lincoln. It became known the Nebraska government was looking for someone who could depict the natural and social history of Nebraska's Native American and pioneer cultures. Several prominent Iowans, including the governor, wrote letters of support for having Grant do this mural. Now, Grant had already worked at the Hotel Chieftain in Council Bluffs, and the Joslin Memorial Museum at Omaha had his painting of Stone City. The university had his painting of Arnold Comes of Age, but in the end, the commission didn't go to Grant, nor did it go to the other two muralists who had applied, Thomas Hart Benton and N.C. Wyeth, who were also in the running for a period of time. The other Nebraska possibility was with the Omaha Playhouse. Grant's maternal uncle, that would be his mother Hattie's brother, Frank Weaver, was a longtime lawyer in the city of Omaha, being a partner in one of the oldest firms in the city, Weaver and Giller. In fact, an item appeared in the Cedar Rapids Gazette that stated, "Grant Wood paints scenes of Brigham Young play in Omaha." It went on to say, "Grant Wood of this city, nationally known native artist, is painting scenes for the first dramatic version of the life and loves of Brigham Young, the famous Mormon, who will have a world premiere in Omaha on April 3rd, 1931. But to me, at least, this seemed a little premature. I called down to the Omaha Playhouse, talked to the people there, and they believed that Grant Wood might have given some ideas for some of the background painting, but didn't do any of the actual painting. But this was too bad because the Playhouse was a really active place in those years. A young and lanky actor named Henry Fonda was involved in many of the leads, and there was also a high school student named Dorothy McGuire who was involved. And often a Mrs. Brand, along with her daughters, was one of the best leading women of the time in Omaha, and her son, Marlon Brando, then just a young boy, watched his mother and siblings perform. Well, the show did go on, and Brigham Young premiered in Omaha during the summer of 1933, later going on to New York. This segment includes what I'm calling companion pieces. During the summer of 1941, just his last paintings that he did, most of you know that Grant put the finishing touches on his last two major oil paintings. They were called Spring in Town and Spring in the Country. And as companion pieces, they were not only were the titles similar, but they portrayed a similar rural and small town theme. This was not the first time that Grant had envisioned companion pieces. In two of his more famous works, he created only one of the pair, announcing but never starting the other. For instance, for an article in the Muscatine Journal and News Tribune of January 19, 1939, Grant stated his ideas for a new allegorical series of paintings. Posted Des Moines said, "Grant Wood, Iowa artist, believes George Washington pictures need a bit more realism and says he's going to set an example. Now on a lecture tour, Wood said when he gets back to Iowa City in February, he's going to start putting at least two American historical stories on canvas. One will be of George Washington and the other of Pocahontas, the Indian maid who saved Captain John Smith in early colonial days, asserting that a large number of old American tales that have almost become myths are gradually being dropped from the public consciousness and the school textbooks. The artist said of his forthcoming works, George is going to be a real little 6-year-old kid, and he's got to be smug. Now, of course, this is not the work he did on Pocahontas because it was never done, but I show it there just as an illustration. The Washington painting did come to fruition, but the Pocahontas never did. Now, why did Grant choose to do the first painting concerning the fable about George Washington? Well, one biographer of Grant Wood felt that Grant's interest may have stemmed from a family heirloom that the Wood family had. Grant's great-grandmother on the Wood side of the family was a woman named Hannah Hollingsworth, and the family had passed down a brown glass flask that would fit nicely into a pocket. And inscribed in the artifact were the words, "This pocket flask belonged to Colonel Hollingsworth of Virginia and was carried by him during the Revolutionary War. He was on George Washington's staff and said George Washington had drunk from it several times." Grant had probably always taken some pride in this connection. And where this flask is that Washington drank from, I couldn't tell you, I don't know. The other companion piece that was never done relates to Grant's most famous work, American Gothic. Of course, you know the background on that, created in 1930. Grant used a dentist and his sister as models and a house in Eldon, Iowa as a backdrop. I know you're all familiar with that, but at the time Grant first exhibited it in Chicago, he announced in a letter to the Des Moines Register on December 28, 1930, that he did have a companion piece in mind. This is what he wrote. He said, "It is my intention later to do a mission bungalow painting as a companion piece with mission bungalow type standing in front of it, whatever those may be. The accent then, of course, would be put in the horizontal rather than the vertical." But again, this painting never seems to have been mentioned again. This segment is Bruce Mahan, I think is the way that's pronounced. Well, you know, museums throughout the world take special interest in their local artists, and time or money they're spent in bringing home the works of art by people who are born in the area or lived there for periods of time. It's usually impossible to obtain all of an artist's work, so this quest is, never really totally finished. But as time goes on, the process of building a collection for the museum continues, and Sean could tell us a lot about that. For many years, the University of Iowa had none of Grant Wood's major paintings. It really wasn't until December 1984 that the university obtained their first major painting by Grant Wood that was titled Plaid Sweater. But there had been attempts made by alumni and faculty members shortly after Grant's death to secure some of his paintings for the university. About 2 months after Grant's unexpected illness and subsequent death, President Virgil Hancher suggested to Bruce Mahan, Director of Alumni Search Services, that he write a letter to Fred Lewis of Harlan, Iowa, who was the chairman of the 1934 Senior Memorial Committee. The letter contained the class's unexpended class gift fund. It had been a common practice for graduating classes to put together funds for use as a memorial to their class. And the 1934 class had $1,012.95 that they originally proposed to be used in revamping the lighting system in the Iowa Memorial Union's lounge. But Mr. Mahan then suggested that the class of 1934 might team with the class of 1942, that the gift might be used to purchase the first in a series of pictures for an art collection to become part of the permanent collection at the Iowa Memorial Union. The first to respond after sending letters concerning this proposal was Manda Zuber, who wrote back from the nurses' quarters at Letterman General Hospital in San Francisco on April 14, 1942. She may have been the first to suggest that the classes purchase a Grant Wood painting, while others quickly joined in both the combination of gifts, and they also joined in saying that a Grant Wood piece seemed very appropriate. So the search began. First, they turned to Dubuque and asked the head librarian at the Dubuque Public Library if they would consider selling Victorian Survival. But the Dubuque Public Library Board minutes of June 12, 1942 explained their answer to the request. It said, a letter was then read from Mr. Earl Harper of the University of Iowa to interview board members concerning the purchase of the Victorian Survival, if deemed advisable. The librarian, having replied that this would not be necessary, and the consensus of opinion of the board members present being against its sale, and no further action should be taken. Well, then they tried Cedar Rapids, and a letter was sent to Jenny E. Post, the principal at Woodrow Wilson High School in Cedar Rapids. And Harper asked whether the school district would be interested in selling young corn. Well, Principal Post immediately responded that young corn was a memorial and, of course, cannot be sold. It had been a memorial to one of the teachers, Lenny Schulman. Well, 3 months later, a third attempt was made. This time, the letter went to Paul Juhl, the director of the Joslin Memorial in Omaha. Harper now asked about Stone City, initially offering a total amount of $2,300. No other funds were available at this time, and using tax revenues for this purpose was not to be considered. In fact, President Hancher even said that he would personally add $200 to it to make it $2,500. Harper used another technique too in trying to convince the Joslin to sell Stone City. This is what he wrote. I realize that this means that a considerable amount would be invested by you in goodwill and in helping with the laudable project of placing a Grant Wood picture at the university where he was sponsored and where he taught. But Grumman didn't fall for this approach. Instead, he responded by stating that his committee is unalterable opposed to the sale of the painting. And he continued, the local association would resent it if they disposed of a painting that they had the foresight to buy before Mr. Wood really attained recognition. Well, how these funds were allotted were eventually is really unknown. With the World War II raging, the issue seemed to have been dropped. As we mentioned, this work, in 1985, this work, Plaid Sweater, was donated to the university by the Blumberg family down in Clinton, Iowa. And of course, a major gift is forthcoming. James Hayes, an Iowa City attorney, he owns the house of Grant Wood called home during his years in the university town. And Jim will gift the house and 4 other adjacent houses to the University of Iowa Foundation, and they're calling it the Grant Wood Colony. So some efforts have certainly been made. There's also a biennial conference on Grant Wood, also fellowships. So the legacy of Grant Wood's association with the University of Iowa will increase in numerous ways. Now I show you 2 depictions here of Plaid Sweater. At the time in which the painting went to the Whitney a few years ago, it was restored. Possibly it had been in the family home, maybe by a fireplace, it's hard to say, but it needed to be cleaned. And you can see after the cleaning what a difference that made in Plaid Sweater. Early in 1933, Grant befriended Park Reinert, a young man living near Wood's Turner Alley studio and home in Cedar Rapids. And Grant quickly noticed Reinert's abilities in both the spoken and written word and asked him to become his personal secretary. Sometime later, Doubleday Dorn Company offered Grant a contract to write his autobiography. And Grant believed that with Park's help, this might be a possibility. Well, Park capably took over the task, and Grant seemed to tell the stories, and Park put it all into the written word. The first 5 chapters were written and the document was 192 pages. It took the reader up to the time the family left their Anamosa area farm and moved to Cedar Rapids when Grant was 10 years old. Grant then decided to use the manuscript for his University of Iowa master's degree thesis. Grant even created a cover for the book that he called Return from Bohemia. Over the years, the autobiography was always portrayed as an almost done, but it never was. Grant may have hoped that Park would benefit after his death with some profit from the work, but the stories were no longer there to record. Reinert's life, of course, changed after Grant's death. He married, had children, and never finished the work. He died in 2000 after a long career writing for various Democratic politicians in the Washington, D.C. area. The next segment is called the American Tobacco Company. Well, in the months just prior to entering the University of Iowa hospitals for surgery in the fall of 1941, Grant was looking into a commission for the American Tobacco Company and had made a trip to North Carolina. Lucky Strike, one of their best-selling cigarettes of the time and sponsor of the popular radio show Hit Parade, had long used pretty girls to sell their product. Their advertising department was now looking into using paintings by American artists in various magazines to show how tobacco was actually grown. Grant told his friend Park Reinert that he had 2 swell ideas for paintings. Other artists that Grant knew the American Tobacco Company was talking to included John Stuart Curry, Thomas Hart Benton, Paul Sample, and others. Unfortunately, Grant knew far too much about the habit of smoking. In an age when most men did smoke and some felt it was even good for one's health, Grant had become a 2-pack-a-day smoker. It hadn't been easy, but he maintained that by Christmas of 1940, and concerned about his health, he had been successful in kicking the habit. This came just a year before the enticing offer from the American Tobacco Company. Grant's health, of course, prevented him from anything except some anticipation regarding this project. The other artists were signed, however, and as early as March 1942, ads for Lucky Strike using the artist's work began to appear in such magazines as Life and Saturday Evening Post. By November of the same year, the American Tobacco Company decided to change their advertising approach once again. They would now base their appeal on the World War that was raging in both Europe and the Pacific and use the slogan, Lucky Strike Green Goes to War. They changed their packaging from green to red and white. In the ad you're now viewing, the advertisement was done by artist Peter Hurd, and it appeared in Life magazine. One can only wonder what ideas Grant might have used. Well, there's lots of small notebooks and sketchbooks belonging to Grant. Here's a couple of sketches that he made. The one on the left there shows a signpost of some kind with ears of corn coming out and the word Cedar Rapids. And the one on the right was found in Jim Hayes' home at 1142 East Court Street. Nothing more is known of this concerning what project Grant might have had in mind. And in one of the final photographs showing him as a teacher, newly appointed professor of fine arts, Grant Wood, is shown talking with a student at the beginning of the fall semester in 1941. Just a few months later, he would enter the hospital and remain there for the rest of his life. Dorothy McCrae, the wife of Grant's friend and teaching colleague at the University of Iowa, said in a 2005 email to Leah Rawson DeLong, the author of When Tillage Begins, Other Arts Follow. This is what Mrs. McCrae said. The work that Park Reinert destroyed at Grant's request while he was in the hospital consisted of a series of pastel, plein air drawings that he had done during the last year, which were a departure from his traditional work. I thought they were quite lovely, but he insisted they be torn up in his presence. And here's Grant Wood's easel. It's at the Figgy, and I thought this quote quite appropriate to finish off my talk with you all today. Art is never finished, only abandoned. So I hope you have enjoyed the show. And here are some of other people that I took some of my PowerPoint from. And Sean, I'll send it back to you then.
Wonderful, Paul. Thank you so very, very much. Okay, we're all back now. And I'm seeing lots of wonderful comments in the chat box, but let's see if there are some questions in there. So there's one comment in here in the chats about the unfinished Iowa State mural series. Do you have anything that you know about that, Paul, that you would like to comment on?
No, in fact, I didn't even know that that was an unfinished. I mean, I knew that was done in 2 segments, but I didn't know what other part of the library or where he was thinking about doing any additional painting. Maybe some of our viewers know more about that than I do.
Yeah, I'm not aware of it either. So if somebody does know,
I see a hand go up, Mel.
Yes, there's a large reading room to the right of the staircase. He has murals on the first floor of the Breaking the Ground, and then the engineering and various other things. And on the 3rd floor, he intended to make a series of murals about the lively arts. And the niches are there. They still exist, and they haven't been occupied, but in I believe it's I believe it that's when in the When Tillage Begins book, there's a reference to a plan for him to have done a series of murals in those locations. Another artist did a mural outside of that room, but I would be curious to know if anything ever happened with that idea for Grant to make these murals about the different lively arts, sort of like George Seldes' writings about the lively arts.
I might comment there just in terms of, I know some of you have read my 3rd spiral bound book that's called Grant Wood and the Iowa State Fair. And that really brings forth this strong connection that Grant Wood had to Iowa State and a woman named Zenobia Ness. And I didn't know that before. I'd always thought that most of the energy went towards the University of Iowa because he lived in Iowa City those last years and worked here. But there was some strong connections with the State Fair, with the Iowa Federation of Women's Clubs, and also with the projects during the Depression, all of which seemed to initiate through Zenobia Ness, one of the instructors at Iowa State.
There's another question in the chat from Sylvia. Was the Harrison School for which Grant made a mural the Harrison that burned? Do you know
Yeah, I don't know.
about that?
So, Sylvia, did you work at the Harrison School?
I did. The one that is on 11th Street Northwest. And I don't ever remember seeing a mural there for Grant Wood. But there was the Harrison School before that did burn. And of course, by the time I was working at Harrison in the 70s and 80s, so maybe by that time the mural had been removed. There was a mural there that was done by a man under Grant Wood's guidance and tutelage, and his name was Hennings, if I can remember right. But it wasn't an actual Grant Wood mural. At least that's what I'm remembering. But and maybe they took it out of the school.
Sean, do you know, Sean, anything about that mural at Harrison?
I don't. I mean, I have vague recollection of it. I'd have to dig a little bit. There'd be something that would be probably in the archives of the school district, I would imagine. And they do have a number of Grant Wood pieces, but I don't know that the mural is one of them. I know there is one, but not in Harrison. So But I don't know if that's the same one and just got moved or what. I'd have to dig on that one.
I did some research on the Harrison School murals in the 90s, and the Henning mural was still there. I assume it still is there, but it was done under Grant Wood's direct consultants. He was a student of Grant Wood's, and it has aviation and various other things in it, but it was not by Grant unless I think he actually helped him make a sketch for it, as if I remember the story correctly. Yep.
And Paul, there's a question about where the quote from Dorothy McRae was taken from.
I had contact with her. She was living in New Mexico, and after Grant Wood and Park Reinhardt had spent the summer of 1941 in the cottage in Clear Lake, they moved into that same cottage, and it wasn't winterized. And she told me in various letters and phone conversations how cold it got on the north shore of Clear Lake during that summer with only a fireplace to use. So it was through correspondence with her. She also told me something that I wish I would have followed up on the time, because we're talking now, I was in touch with her in 2005 or 2006. But she said they had home movies that they made of spending that winter in the cottage at Clear Lake. And I would have liked to have seen what the inside of that cottage looked like. And that probably would have given us some clues. She didn't indicate that she had any films of Grant Wood or Park Reinhardt. They were made the year following, but it would have been interesting to see nonetheless. And those were all in New Mexico at that time.
I don't see any other questions in the chat. Does anyone on the call still want to unmute themselves and ask Paul a direct question? I think he would be open to that.
I'm sure there were a lot of other abandoned plans and unfinished plans, but and some I had in my spiral bound book, a couple of others, but I thought these would be the ones that maybe would serve our audience with the greatest interest today.
And I might add that you can get Paul's spiral bound book at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art store.
Right.
So, and other places, but I figured it was the perfect time for a shameless plug.
Don't be shameless in it, because that's a wonderful gift shop, as many of you know. And what a great spot to buy something special for someone special.
Especially if it's about Grant Wood.
You bet.
Paul, this is Diane Keys.
Hi, Diane.
Good afternoon. Hi. I was so interested to hear about Grant Wood's personality, that he hardly, his sister hadn't seen him lose his temper, because I haven't heard people talk much about that. And the pictures I see of him show a sweetness in his look, in his countenance. And do you have any more information about his personality and what he was truly like?
Well, first of all, Nan would always stand up for Grant no matter what. So we never know for sure exactly what kind of meanings some of her words had. I well remember going to the State Historical Society, finding a book that was written in 1944, shortly after Grant's death, by a man that no one wanted to have a biography written by. And they still have it at the State Historical Society here. And Nan took the book and she wrote, "This is garbage. This didn't happen at all. I've never heard of this before." And all kinds of comments throughout. So I guess what I'm saying is that maybe perhaps around Nan, she was just recording what she had seen. And who knows, there's very few people still living that knew Grant Wood. Mindell is, however, and she said that he was just the sweetest man and she loved working for him with no problems, nor did she ever see him angry. I remember her telling me that also.
Thank you, Paul. There was another question in the chat. or a comment and then sort of reflection, I guess. Grant won the fine arts competition at the Iowa State Fair 4 years in a row, starting in 1929. I know this is an area of research for you. Then he went on to paint American Gothic 1930. How important was that first win for Grant in 1929 at the Iowa State Fair?
Well, actually, he didn't win in 1929. He did get first place in oils, but the prominent victory in the art salon was a sweepstakes award. And he did not receive the sweepstakes award in 29. He did receive it in 30, 31, and 32.
And I had heard, and maybe you can clarify this for me, that he stopped submitting after that because he felt that he was dominating the field too much. Is that true to your knowledge? Okay.
He did, but he supported it throughout the rest of his lifetime. He would, because of his friendship with Zenobia, he would allow her to see. I remember in the book, there's a picture of a sketch of Death on the Ridge Road, and he allowed that to be brought in. Stone City came from Nebraska, and he showed that at the state fair too. Really what Zenobia Ness did was, Grant was well known in Cedar Rapids and Eastern Iowa, but by coming to the state fair and being sponsored by the Iowa Federation Women's Clubs, which were really the creme de la creme of women's organizations at that time, his exposure was then throughout the state, Northwest, Southeast, Southwest, Southeast, or Northeast. So everybody had a chance to know who Grant Wood was. And that's why I wanted to do the Spiral Bound on the state fair, because I thought it told a totally different story too, that I enjoyed researching.
And I think that also goes to Diane's question about Grant Wood's personality and sort of these windows and insights that we get through his actions, purposely not submitting for competition work at the Iowa State Fair so that, he wouldn't dominate it. By this time, of course, he is famous and obviously extraordinarily skilled as well, but allowing other people to compete fairly, I think also gives you a little window into his personality at the same time. So,
unfortunately, 5 letters to Mrs. Ness have survived, and I put those in the book, and they show too a fine person, a fine friend that we all would like to have, I feel.
Okay. And Susan, do you have a question? I see you've got a hand up icon.
Actually, I have a comment about his personality. May I speak to that, please?
Of course, please.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Wood, as my dad always called him, lived next door to Mr. Wood at 1154 East Court Street. There was a small house between them, but they considered themselves, quote, next door neighbors. My Uncle George, his oldest brother, was the subject of Spring in Town, Mr. Wood's last painting. My Uncle George had a 100th birthday this year, even though he's now gone. And Swope's Gallery in Terre Haute, Indiana, did have a big birthday party for him around the painting and had pictures of him in later years where he was director of the School for Handicapped Children at the University of Iowa for 40 years. My father mowed his yard at a young age and had a close friendship with him. He was a young boy, very personable, and he said to me on a videotape that my sister smartly recorded, Dad was talking about Mr. Wood, and he made the comment, quote, "I never saw him angry or upset. The only time he seemed irritated was when Sarah, his wife in what I personally think was an arranged marriage, did something that he felt was awkward. My dad never had a bad word for anybody, but he did have a not kind, he didn't have good words for Mrs. Maxwell Sherman, whatever her last name was, and her son. They were both very acting entitled and unusual. But he said that Mr. Wood was very kind, caring. He paid Dad in ice cream for mowing his yard every week. And they'd sit and chat together, and they always had fine conversations, Dad said. In addition, he gifted Dad his croquet set, which our family of 10 used for many years, beating the you-know-what out of it, not realizing where it had come from. But I think he would have liked it anyway. So that just reassures from a person who is a great historian, my father, Robert E. Devine of 1154 East Court Street, that
Well,
he was a kind, caring man and was a good person to people that he cared about. And that seemed to be almost everybody. Thank you for your time.
Susan, you're going to enjoy then a couple of photos I'm going to show, because this is George Devine in front of his, he's the man that was tending the field in Spring in Town. And this was taken in Terre Haute, Indiana during a visit he made there in the early 1970s. In addition to that, a local artist in Terre Haute made a painting of George standing in front of the Spring in Town, but just with his shadow, not with his body. And you maybe have not seen this, Susan, but it's an enjoyable picture too.
Actually, I have seen it. It was created by Mr. Paul Shepard, and I have reached out to him, not knowing if he is even alive anymore, but reached out to him to see if he does have any lithographs of that. It was not a terribly wonderful capture of Uncle George, but it was quite fine. Attempt to capture him in his spirit, which was wonderful.
He is alive. I did a Zoom for the Sheldon Swope Museum in Terre Haute, and he was part of our audience. His name is James Shepard, and this
thank you.
Yeah, this was titled "Me and My Shadow" and done in 1974.
Yes. Uncle George had not yet developed the COPD that was very challenging for his life. Unfortunately, Uncle George was a sergeant in the Army at Normandy at D-Day, and the terrors of what he saw that day just stuck with him forever. He was our favorite uncle. He had 3 sons, and my dad had 6 daughters, and we'd go to visit, and Uncle George would just love playing with the little girls and talking and pretending to be a monkey. He was tormented by the demons of D-Day, and for 20 years we didn't see him. Luckily that changed, but he was a wonderful man. And interestingly enough, our youngest son, Kevin Keeney, is Black Irish like Uncle George is. And when she was little, I'd walk back and forth in front of Spring in Town, because it's been in every one of my 8 siblings' houses since we were married. And she would turn her head, my granddaughter would turn her head to look, and I didn't know what she wanted. When she got to speak, she said, "Daddy, Daddy." She thought it was her daddy, and in actual fact, it does look just like her father. So George Devine was a wonderful, wonderful person to go forward in the world. And I am so proud that he's my uncle, not just because of being the subject of the painting. I do have a photograph of Mr. Wood sketching Uncle George in the garden between them, which I got from the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art many years ago. Thank you very much. It is a fine, fine gift shop. And it was the time when the Swopes Gallery had lent us the painting. And I just think that us having that relationship with Grant Wood via my uncle and my father is worth hearing about in this presentation. So thank you for letting me share about his fine personality.
Thank you for sharing, Susan. We all appreciate that.
I know we've run over a tiny bit, but that is our way. But if there are any last minute questions, I'm sure Paul would be willing to answer them. Anybody?
There's someone still
Oh.
named Anna Armstrong Johnston on the
Wait a
call.
minute, somebody was talking. Hang on a second. What? Linda, did you say, had you started? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
We can.
Have you, have all of you been to the Eldon American Gothic Center to see what they have done there? That was my great-grandparents' home in American Gothic. And I grew up in Eldon, so I always promote it when I ever have the chance.
Well, how wonderful.
Wonderful. That's great.
Actually, now you can go into the house itself. So I was in the house during this past year and looked right out through the Gothic window at the surroundings around Eldon. I enjoyed it a lot.
The thing I did not know until I was in there was that the window in the front has a window exactly across from it in the back, so that it's you can see through it. My dad used to talk about spending nights there with his grandparents.
Sure.
That's terrific. Thanks for sharing that.
Yes,
Appreciate
thank you.
that.
So I'm the one that shared the item about Anna Armstrong Johnston, who's with us today. And if she would unmute her screen, maybe she would share some of the memories that her mother had with Grant Wood as he designed their home in Cedar Rapids, what he was like. Do you know how to unmute, Anna, in your upper right-hand corner?
All right.
There you go.
Marilyn and I went
There she
to
is.
grade school together, and she's done a number of articles about Grant Wood. I probably, if I ever met Grant Wood, it was in utero, because I was born in 35 and Pleasant Hill was built earlier. But Mother had so many pleasant memories of the things that he did. We're talking a lot about his paintings, but not about his skill in doing a number of different crafts. I know that Marilyn Heiss has a silver piece that was done by him that we don't think of his doing. Mother, he would take Mother antiquing. She was in her late 20s and early 30s. And they needed china doorknobs for if it was going to be authentic in the house. And he knew of a place that had never sold their china doorknobs. And they were able to find 50 doorknobs to do that. When they were doing a bow out from the dining room that were going to be for plants. He wanted to invert the bricks so that the water would stand in the bricks rather than run off. When they were doing scallops over the porch that they had seen in another house, he sat down, Mother said he just got out a big strip of paper and drew the form for the woodworker, the carpenters to do. He just could do anything and was so interested. And she said it was so much fun. I have now three little dishes. I broke one and she said, we got this antiquing. I never spent more than $5 on anything. So that was a very happy time of that he knew about these places. If we needed to collect 12 chairs for the dining room, he knew where to find them and then did the design. Someone else put in the stencil, but he drew the stencil. And so I think the Renwick exhibit I thought was so interesting. Joan Bachman and I went to that at different times, but it showed his crafts. And I don't know that we think of that. He was quite astonishing.
Well, echoing your point, if you come to see Grant Wood Revealed, You'll see a lot of his work in metalwork and the other decorative arts. That's part of the point of that show. When we haven't had that material out since we did the 2005 show that traveled to the Renwick that you referenced. But that's we have 5 galleries, 165 works currently on view by Grant Wood right now. But the Grant Wood Revealed is a show that looks at his youthful work, looks at his decorative arts work, looked at his commission pieces, looks at his lithographs, looks at his series for Indian Creek, looks at his portraiture, lots of things that people don't think of right away. They might think of something like Young Corn or American Gothic, but he was an extraordinarily diverse artist, lots of different interests, lots of different abilities. And we hope that Grant Wood Revealed shares that more with a wider public. So if you are in a position to come to the Museum of Art, check out that exhibition. It really is a kind of landmark moment to take in all of Grant Wood, really, and to see him for the very complex artist that he really was. Anything else before we wrap things up?
I would make one other, that women with plants, with of course the very famous apron and the pin. Mrs. Wood gave my mother some starts from that. And for years, the Cedar Rapids Gardening Club sold the mother-in-law tongue for years. And I'm sure there are many people who celebrate that plant still.
Actually, we have cuttings from that same plant for sale in the museum store. So that plant still lives on.
Probably from the ones my mother got originally.
Or some sort of offshoot of it, I'm sure. Yes.
Well, many offshoots.
Exactly.
Thank you. It's been wonderful.
Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. Paul, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And
Thanks to everybody for coming on today. So very nice. Very, very nice.
And
next week, we will have another lecture by Wanda Korn, same time on Sunday at 2 o'clock. Please plan to join us. And then the week after that, Tara Tippelman from the History Center will be talking about the Cherry series. So that should be fascinating as well. If you have any questions you need to register, you can do that through our website, crma.org. So thank you all for your time today. Paul, thank you for enlightening us yet again. And we will see you hopefully soon, either through our next Zoom lecture or in the museum itself. All right. Thank you all.